He thought he'd found his happy ending, but one phone call changed everything. Now, he's caught in a web of lies, secrets, and a final act of revenge that no one saw coming. I grew up in a small town called Rockford, located in Illinois. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business, and secrets never lasted long. A single misstep could quickly turn into gossip at every dinner table, spreading faster than wildfire. My mischief often reached my parents before I even stepped through the door, thanks to the town's relentless rumor mill. As the years passed, Rockford evolved into a desirable suburb, its close proximity to Chicago driving up housing prices. Longtime residents struggled to afford homes, creating a divide between established families and newcomers who saw the area as nothing more than a temporary stepping stone. At 22, I married my first love, Lauren. We had been together since we were teenagers, and I truly believed that our love would stand the test of time. But Lauren had other plans. In a town of about 15,000 people, news spread like wildfire, and keeping secrets was almost impossible. Lauren and I first met in high school, Rockford Central High, a large, outdated building that served students from several surrounding villages. The overcrowded classrooms and indifferent teachers didn't exactly suit a troublemaker like me. I was always the tall, quiet kid who found himself getting into fights or caught in some form of trouble. I had no real friends, and my family didn't quite understand me, leaving me feeling like an outsider, until Lauren came into my life. She was naturally beautiful, athletic, and had a radiant smile that could light up any room. Lauren was effortlessly popular, kind to everyone, and completely unaware of the impact she had on people. I admired her from a distance, convinced she was out of my league. Back then, I was awkward, skinny, with a buzz cut, and an ever-present scowl that hid how lost I felt inside. One day, to my complete surprise, she approached me and said, "Why haven't you asked me out yet?" From that moment, we were inseparable. Despite my reputation as the town's troublemaker, Lauren saw something in me that no one else did. By the age of 16, Lauren and I were officially a couple. Her parents, however, were far from thrilled about our relationship. They couldn't understand why their lovely, promising daughter was dating someone like me, a boy who couldn't seem to stay out of trouble. On the flip side, my parents were overjoyed, hoping Lauren would be a positive influence on me. Being the youngest in a large family with much older siblings made me even more withdrawn and introspective. In contrast, Lauren was an only child, the apple of her parents' eyes, spoiled with affection and attention. This difference in upbringing eventually led to tension in our relationship. Still, Lauren and I believed our love could withstand anything. Even when her father tried to break us apart, we stayed together. Lauren's optimism was infectious, and she motivated me to change my ways, encouraging me to focus more on my education. While neither of us had our sights set on college, Lauren seemed destined to work for her father, who owned a chain of popular furniture stores named Woodland Interiors across Illinois. By the time she was 22, she was already managing one of the stores and was on her way to becoming a successful businesswoman. I, on the other hand, left school at 17 and started an apprenticeship as an auto mechanic at Pete's Auto Shop, a well-known local garage. Thanks to my natural talent for diagnosing engine problems, I quickly earned a reputation as one of the best apprentices they'd ever had. By 24, I became a fully qualified mechanic. Feeling confident, I proposed to Lauren, who said yes without hesitation. My parents were overjoyed, but her father, Richard, was furious. Richard almost threw me out of their house when I came over to ask for his blessing. "You'll never be good enough for my daughter," he growled. But Lauren's mother, Sandra, managed to calm him down, and we were married a few months later in a small church just outside of Rockford. Richard refused to look me in the eye as we exchanged vows, but I didn't care. I had Lauren, and that was all that mattered. It took years for our relationship to reach its full potential, especially when it came to physical intimacy. We waited until Lauren was 19 before taking that step. I saved up enough money to rent a nice hotel room in Chicago for a romantic night together. I remember every detail: her laugh, the way she nervously bit her lip, and how we spent the night wrapped in each other's arms, laughing and cherishing every moment. That night became a memory we would return to whenever life got tough. In the early years of our marriage, I was happier than I'd ever been. I had been promoted to foreman at Pete's auto shop, and Lauren continued to climb the ladder at Woodland Interiors. But as I took on more responsibilities at work, Lauren's father continued to raise her salary, making sure I knew that she was the real breadwinner. It was his way of reminding me that I would never measure up. Despite this, Lauren's generous spirit never wavered. She would buy me expensive gifts like a gold watch, designer suits, and even booked us a vacation to Miami Beach just to take my mind off work. I, on the other hand, poured my heart into renovating our modest cottage, turning it into a cozy home where we could start a family one day. But after that vacation to Miami, things started to change between us. During our trip to Miami Beach, we met another couple around our age, Adam and Megan, who were loud, flashy, and overly interested in showing off their wealth. I quickly grew tired of their constant bragging about their luxurious lifestyle, but Lauren seemed captivated by them. One evening, after we returned to our hotel, I mentioned how obnoxious I found Adam and Megan's behavior. Lauren snapped at me for the first time, accusing me of lacking ambition and being content with mediocrity. I was stunned. I thought we were building a life together. But clearly, Lauren was starting to want something more, something I wasn't giving her. After that vacation, I noticed subtle changes in Lauren's behavior. She became more restless, frequently talking about wanting a bigger house, a newer car, and vacations to exotic destinations. Having grown up getting whatever she wanted, the concept of saving and waiting was foreign to her. Richard didn't help matters either. He continued to spoil her with extravagant gifts, even buying her a brand new BMW convertible for her 25th birthday, while I still drove my old pickup truck. Lauren started going out more often with her single friends, while I spent most nights working late or practicing martial arts at the local gym. It was my way of clearing my mind and channeling my frustration. We reserved weekends for each other, going out for dinner and dancing at the Golden Vine, a local bar in Rockford that we had always loved. But even then, I could sense that Lauren was pulling away. One morning, I decided to surprise Lauren by coming home early from work. I needed to grab some paperwork and check the mail. As I walked through the door, I noticed the light on the answering machine blinking. Without thinking, I pressed play, and my heart stopped. It was Lauren's voice, talking to a man I didn't recognize. They were flirting, laughing about their time together, and even mocking me. My hands shook as I replayed the message, hoping it was some kind of sick joke. But it wasn't. Lauren was having an affair. I called in to work and canceled all my plans, then waited for her to return home. When Lauren walked through the door, I confronted her. She tried to act clueless, but I played the recording, watching as her shoulders slumped. "Oh, great," she muttered before storming out of the house, leaving me standing there in disbelief and rage. I never heard from Lauren again after that day. I tried reaching out, but Richard blocked my attempts, making it clear I was no longer welcome in their family. He warned me to stay away from his daughter and told me that I would be hearing from their lawyer soon. Not long after, I was served with divorce papers, along with a restraining order, claiming they feared for their safety. It was absurd. I had no intention of hurting anyone. I just wanted to understand why Lauren had left. I took 2 weeks off work, spending most of that time at home, drinking and trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Toward the end of my self-imposed isolation, the doorbell rang. Hoping it was Lauren, I opened the door, only to find Sandra, her mother, standing there with tears in her eyes. "Oh my God, Matt, look at you," she whispered, using my first name. "What do you want, Sandra?" "Where's Lauren?" I snapped, my patience worn thin. She sat down at the kitchen table, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry, Matt. She's made it clear she wants a divorce. Lauren left town. She's on vacation somewhere, trying to figure things out. It's not your fault," I said, sitting across from her. "I just don't understand why. Maybe if I hadn't spoiled her so much growing up, she'd appreciate what she had with you." Sandra sighed, shaking her head. "Richard always gave her everything she wanted. I just didn't think she'd throw away her marriage because of it." "Was it because I couldn't give her everything?" I asked, frustration boiling over. "She's just confused," Sandra replied, her eyes welling up with tears. I managed a weak laugh. No need to sugarcoat it. Shut up, she chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. Now, go take a shower while I clean up this mess. I obeyed, standing under the hot water until it turned cold, trying to wash away the pain and confusion. An hour later, I returned to the kitchen, feeling a little more sober, but with a pounding headache. Sandra handed me a cup of coffee. "Have you eaten?" she asked. "I don't think so," I replied. "Idiot," she scolded, rolling her eyes. "Sit down, I'll make you something." I sat down, sipping the coffee, my hands still trembling. Soon I felt nauseous and rushed to the bathroom. When I returned, Sandra had prepared a bowl of homemade chicken soup. "Think you can keep that down?" she asked gently. "I'll try," I answered. As she left, she told me to come by her house the next day for a proper meal. The following day, I pulled into my former in-law's driveway. Sandra opened the door before I could even knock and ushered me inside. She was wearing a casual but form-fitting dress, something that made her look more youthful than I remembered. Her hair, usually tied back, was loose around her shoulders, and for a moment, I felt an awkward tension in the air. "I listened to the message yesterday," she said softly, leading me to the living room. "I'm so sorry, Matt. I can't understand why Lauren would do this to you." Feeling ashamed, I looked away. "I thought she was happy," I muttered. "So did I," Sandra responded, her tone filled with regret. It was strange seeing her this vulnerable. Growing up, I'd always seen Sandra as the polished, elegant wife of a successful businessman. Now, she looked just as lost as I felt. She paused, and then in a more casual, almost hesitant tone, she said, "You know, Richard's out of town for the next few days." "Why are you telling me that?" I asked, taken aback by her sudden change in demeanor. "Because," she replied, inching closer, "I've always wondered why my daughter married you and not me." I stared at her, stunned into silence. "Sandra, I'm not that old," she cut me off, with a hint of a smile. Before I could react, she kissed me, softly at first, then with an urgency that took me by surprise. I knew it was wrong, but after everything that had happened, I needed to feel something, anything, to remind me that I was still alive. And in that moment, Sandra provided that escape. We ended up in the guest bedroom, the very room where Lauren and I had slept during family holidays. It was surreal, almost like I was living someone else's life. As the afternoon sun faded, Sandra whispered, "You're only the second man I've ever been with." "Really?" I asked, catching my breath. "I assumed you'd been with others." "No," she said quietly. "Richard was my first, but you're the first one who made me feel young again." I nodded, not knowing how to respond. We showered together and then dressed. "I'm starving," I admitted, eyeing the sandwiches she'd made earlier. "You'll have to get takeout," she teased. "Richard can have this food. After all, you've had his wife all afternoon, so he might as well have your lunch." With a playful smile, she pushed me out the door with a final kiss. Our affair continued for several months. Sandra and I met whenever we could, usually at her house while Richard was at work or away on business. It was reckless, and we both knew it, but neither of us wanted to stop. On my father's advice, I hired his old friend, a divorce lawyer, to handle the legal proceedings with Lauren. She was suing for alimony and half of our assets, even though she was the one who had cheated. My lawyer managed to uncover that Lauren had been receiving far less from her father's business than she'd led me to believe, and that she had almost no savings. Her fancy BMW was even leased, not owned outright. Lauren demanded we sell our house and split the proceeds equally, despite the fact that I had paid for all the renovations. We countersued, citing her infidelity, but her attorney argued that I had emotionally neglected her, driving her into another man's arms. The judge didn't seem entirely convinced, but wasn't unsympathetic to her claims. In the end, I was forced to sell the house and pay a portion of her legal fees, but I avoided paying alimony. I was left with only a few $1,000s and no place to call home. A few months later, I relocated to Evanston, just outside of Chicago, renting a small 2-bedroom apartment. My affair with Sandra continued, but it became less frequent as the reality of our situation set in. She visited whenever she could, using shopping trips to the city as an excuse to spend the afternoons and evenings in my bed. I hadn't seen or heard from Lauren since the divorce. According to Sandra, Lauren had moved into a high-rise condo downtown, paid for with her settlement money and a generous loan from Richard. Apparently, Lauren had cut ties with her mother after an explosive argument, siding with her father and choosing to forget that Sandra even existed. "Lauren won't visit me anymore," Sandra confessed one afternoon, her head resting on my chest. "It's like I don't have a daughter." "That's her loss," I replied, kissing the top of her head. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. What hurt the most was that Lauren had erased all traces of our life together, as if I had never existed. That cold, indifferent look she gave me the last time I saw her in court was burned into my memory. Months after the divorce, I learned from a mutual friend that, long before our separation, Lauren had been visiting a bar called Midnight Echo in downtown Chicago, a place known for its reputation as a hotspot for wealthy married women looking for casual affairs. She had been seen with several different men, but was frequently spotted with an older, flashier man who drove a sleek sports car. This deepened the wound of betrayal, and I couldn't help but wonder what she had been looking for that I couldn't provide. The following summer, my co-workers from Pete's auto shop invited me to join them for a night out to celebrate one of their birthdays. They had planned a night of bar hopping, ending at some upscale club. At first, I wasn't interested, but they convinced me to come along, insisting it would be a good distraction. After hours of drinks and loud music, I decided to call it a night, ignoring their jabs about me being the old man of the group. As I was walking down a quiet street, heading toward a late-night diner, a car door suddenly swung open, hitting me in the hip. "Watch where you're going, idiot," the driver snapped as he stepped out of the car, glaring at me. "Sorry, I didn't see you," I replied, trying to avoid a confrontation. But then, I heard a familiar voice. "Leave him alone, Mike. He's just some fool," the voice drawled. I turned and saw Lauren, sitting in the passenger seat of the luxurious car. "You know this guy?" Mike asked, looking between me and her. "Yeah," Lauren replied, her tone dripping with contempt. "He's my ex-husband." "Is he now?" Mike sneered, turning back to me. "Well, it looks like you need to be taught a lesson." Before I could react, Mike shoved me, but my reflexes kicked in from years of martial arts training. I pushed him back, harder than I meant to, and he slammed against the car with a thud. He groaned and slumped down, clearly in pain. "So much for teaching me a lesson," I muttered, turning to walk away. "You jerk!" Lauren screamed after me, rushing over to Mike. I kept walking, feeling a mix of anger and bitterness as I flagged down a taxi and headed back to my apartment. The next morning I woke up to a loud banging on my door. Groggy, I stumbled to open it and found 2 police officers standing there. "Matthew Harris?" one of them asked. "Yes, that's me," I replied, confused. "You're under arrest for the manslaughter of Michael Turner," the officer said. "You have the right to remain silent, but anything you say can be used against you in court." "Manslaughter?" I stammered, completely shocked. "What are you talking about?" The officers handcuffed me and took me to the station where I was formally charged. In the holding cell, I kept replaying the events of the previous night. Mike, Lauren, what had really happened? I hadn't hurt him that badly, had I? After hours of interrogation, a lawyer was finally assigned to me. He refused to let the police question me further until he got the full story. An hour later, he returned with a grave expression. "Mike hit his head on the car door when you pushed him. He suffered a brain hemorrhage and died before help could arrive," he explained. "I only pushed him," I protested. "That's not what the police think," he said, shaking his head. "There's a witness who claims you started the fight." "Who?" I demanded. "His companion, the woman with him. She says you attacked him without provocation," my lawyer said. "Does that sound true to you?" "No, she's lying," I yelled. "That woman is my ex-wife, Lauren. She's been lying about me for years." My lawyer sighed deeply. "This isn't going to be easy," he muttered. Things took an even darker turn when I received a letter from Sandra while awaiting trial. She wrote that she couldn't forgive her husband or daughter for what they had done to me, and that she had decided to leave Richard. She had even tried to testify in my defense, but her statements were dismissed as irrelevant. She ended her letter by saying, "I'm not ashamed of you, Matt, but I'm ashamed of my own family. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you." Her words shattered me. When my trial finally began, Lauren took the stand, painting a picture of me as a violent man who she had feared throughout our marriage. She conveniently left out her affairs, portraying her new boyfriend, Mike, as a gentle and innocent man. Despite my lawyer's best efforts, the jury believed Lauren's version of events. I was convicted of manslaughter, and the judge, swayed by Lauren's tearful testimony, sentenced me to 20 years in prison. My family cried as I was led away, while Lauren simply watched with a cold, triumphant look in her eyes. Entering the high-security prison for the first time was like stepping into a nightmare. I had no idea how I was going to survive. My cellmate, David Caldwell, was a small, wiry man serving 8 years for art forgery. Despite his fragile appearance, David had an air of confidence that intrigued me. Over time, we became friends, and I discovered that beneath his delicate demeanor was a sharp mind and a wicked sense of humor. One day, I found a gang member threatening David for his cigarettes. Without thinking, I intervened, delivering a swift kick to the bully's stomach. He dropped to the ground, gasping for air, and I stared him down until he backed off. From that moment on, David took me under his wing, showing me the unspoken rules of prison life. Prison was never quiet. The nights were filled with the sounds of crying, shouting, and the constant clanking of metal doors. Insomnia kept me awake, and I spent endless hours staring at the ceiling, replaying the events that had led me here. David stayed up with me, often distracting me with stories of his life as a forger. It was through him that I learned to accept my reality, even if it was just for a moment. David warned me that some of Mike's associates, who were tied to a local crime ring, were planning to come after me. "They're looking for revenge," he said one night. "So when it comes, you'd better be ready." A few weeks later, 3 men cornered me in the showers. 2 were about my height, while the third, a shorter man with a shiv, stood in front, smirking. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I also knew this was my moment of truth. There were no guards in sight, and it was clear that these men meant to do serious harm. Archie's words echoed in my mind. "It's you or them." I acted quickly, delivering a roundhouse kick to the man on the right, sending him crashing into the wall. The second man lunged at me, but I ducked under his swing and landed a blow to his ribs. As he doubled over, I grabbed his head and drove my knee into his face. The man with the shiv hesitated, and I used that moment to disarm him, twisting his wrist until he dropped the weapon. In the heat of the moment, something snapped inside me. I grabbed the man by the neck and slammed him against the wall, my rage boiling over. Without thinking, I choked him until he went limp, and when I let go, he crumpled to the floor. Blood was splattered on my hands, and I stood there, panting, as the other 2 scrambled to their feet and ran. I'm not innocent anymore, I thought, feeling a sense of emptiness wash over me. Rumors of the incident spread quickly, and although an investigation was launched, the 2 survivors stuck to the story that they had slipped and fallen. Inside the prison, the power dynamic shifted in my favor, and soon I was approached by Vince Russo, the unofficial boss of the inmates. Vince was a charismatic and ruthless gangster who had been running his empire from inside the prison walls for years. "You handled yourself well," he said, lighting a cigarette as he sat across from me in the mess hall. "I could use someone like you." "I just want to serve my time," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Vince smirked. "Not an option, Matt. In here, you're either useful or you're a target, and if you refuse, your family could end up paying the price. I know where they live." The threat was clear. I had no choice but to accept his offer. I shook Vince's hand, sealing a deal that would change my life in prison. Over the next few months, I worked for Vince, handling various tasks around the prison. In return, I received certain privileges: better food, private workout sessions, and protection from the other inmates. It was through Vince that I met Rachel, the prison warden's secretary. Desperate for attention and money, Rachel had struck a deal with Vince, and she occasionally indulged in secret rendezvous with the inmates he selected. Every month, I was summoned to the warden's office, where Rachel would be waiting. These encounters were brief, but provided a momentary escape from the reality of prison life. I learned to harden myself, to push away any feelings of guilt or shame. It was just another part of surviving. David eventually finished his sentence, and we promised to stay in touch. He had been my lifeline in those early years, and when he walked out of the gates, I felt the loneliness crash over me once more. True to his word, David wrote to me regularly and even called when he could. As I continued to work for Vince, I earned a reputation as someone not to be messed with. But that reputation came with its own challenges. One night, a group of inmates cornered me in my cell, seeking revenge for a job I'd done for Vince. They had no idea that I had been training every day in the yard, preparing for moments like this. By the time the guards arrived, 2 of my attackers were unconscious, and the 3rd was begging for mercy. After that, Vince started calling me his ace. And while I appreciated the fear and respect that came with the title, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had lost a piece of myself along the way. As the years passed, I slowly accepted my new life. But the pain of losing Lauren never fully disappeared. It lingered, like a scar that refused to fade. I spent my nights lying awake, wondering if she ever thought about me, if she ever felt any guilt for what she had done. The answer didn't matter, though. I was stuck in a place where guilt and regret had no room to grow. My family struggled with my imprisonment as much as I did. 2 years into my sentence, my father died of a heart attack. A year later, my mother passed away. My older sister told me it was from a broken heart, and that my actions had crushed my parents. I was devastated, but there was nothing I could do. My nieces and nephews distanced themselves from me, blaming me for the loss of their grandparents. By the time I was paroled 20 years later, one sister had passed away, and the other had cut all contact with me. I walked out of prison in my late 40s with no family, no friends, and nowhere to go. That's when David stepped back into my life. True to his word, he was waiting for me at the gates with a grin on his face, leaning against a sleek black car. He had aged, but the years had been kind to him. There was a sparkle in his eye as he handed me a set of clothes and said, "Welcome back to the land of the living, Matt." David drove me to a luxury hotel, the kind of place I could never have afforded before prison. When we arrived, 2 stunning women greeted me in the lobby and followed us to the suite. They were models, and that night, I forgot all about Lauren, Vince, and the 20 years that had been stolen from me. The next morning, as I sat on the balcony nursing a headache and staring out at the city skyline, I turned to David. "How can you afford all this?" I asked, still in disbelief. "I told you. I took your advice and started painting seriously," he chuckled. "I found my niche, and now people can't get enough of my work." "But this—" I gestured around at the opulence. David leaned back, smirking. "You've been gone a long time, my friend. Things have changed. I've built a bit of an empire." The truth was, David had become a highly successful and sought-after artist. His work had caught the attention of an art critic's daughter, which led to a glowing review, skyrocketing his fame and turning his paintings into prized possessions. One of his most recent works had sold for $500,000. Over the following days, David insisted on buying me an entirely new wardrobe and getting me back into shape. He took me to the gym every morning, and by the end of the first week, I began to recognize the person staring back at me in the mirror. David had also arranged for us to stay in a villa he owned in Santa Barbara, California. It was a stunning, sprawling estate with ocean views, an infinity pool, and more bedrooms than I could count. For the first time in decades, I felt a sense of freedom wash over me. "You've got a second chance, Matt," David said one evening as we sat on the deck, watching the sunset. "Don't waste it." During the day, I would swim laps in the pool, run along the beach, and work out in the villa's private gym. At night, David would host parties, inviting friends, models, and the occasional celebrity. It was a life of luxury and excess, but I was still haunted by my past. One morning, as I was swimming naked in the pool, I noticed Marissa, one of David's housekeepers, standing by the patio with an amused smile on her face. "Good morning, Mr. Harris," she called out. "I see you're enjoying the view." "Sorry, I didn't think anyone was up yet," I replied, feeling a bit embarrassed. "No need to apologize," she laughed. "You're not the first man I've seen doing laps in his birthday suit." Over time, Marissa and I became friends. She was around my age, with a warm smile and a sharp wit. She had worked for David for years and told me that he had a reputation for taking in strays like me. "He has a good heart," she said one afternoon, as she handed me a cup of coffee. "But he doesn't let many people see it." I nodded, grateful to have found someone who seemed to understand my complicated feelings. One night, as I was finishing up a workout, David walked into the gym and handed me a plane ticket. "It's time to move on," he said. "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. "I've arranged for you to work on a cruise ship," he explained. "You'll be bartending, traveling the world, and getting paid for it. It's the perfect way to start over." I hesitated. "What about my parole?" David grinned. "Already taken care of. You've got a new identity now, one that's squeaky clean. Just don't get into trouble, okay?" I stared at the ticket in my hand, feeling a mix of excitement and fear. It was an opportunity I never thought I'd have, a chance to rebuild my life. "Thank you," I finally said, my voice thick with emotion. "Don't thank me yet," David replied. "Just promise me you'll make the most of it." A few weeks later, I found myself on a luxury cruise ship sailing the Caribbean, starting a new chapter of my life. My fake identity was solid, and I quickly adapted to my role as a bartender in the Seaside Lounge, a high-end bar on the ship's upper deck. It was a world away from my old life, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of freedom that was both exhilarating and terrifying. On my third night on the job, I noticed a stunning woman performing at the piano bar adjacent to the lounge. She had a voice like velvet, and every note she sang seemed to pull at something deep within me. Her name was Kate. After her set, she came up to the bar and ordered a glass of red wine. "Rough crowd tonight?" I asked, pouring her drink. She laughed softly. "Not at all. They're just not as lively as I'd hoped." "Well, you definitely liven things up," I replied, sliding the glass toward her. Kate looked at me, studying my face. "You're new here, aren't you?" "Is it that obvious?" I joked, wiping down the counter. "Just a little," she teased, her eyes sparkling. "Most of the bartenders I've met on these ships are either jaded or flirtatious. You're different." "Different good or different bad?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Different good," she replied, taking a sip of her wine. "You don't seem like you're pretending to be someone else." We continued talking, and I learned that Kate had been performing on cruise ships for over a decade. She had seen the world, from the beaches of the Mediterranean to the fjords of Norway. But there was a hint of sadness in her voice when she talked about her life at sea. "It's a lonely existence," she admitted one night after the bar had emptied. "You meet thousands of people, but you're always saying goodbye." "Well, maybe it's time you stopped running," I said, surprised by my own words. Kate stared at me, her eyes searching mine. "Maybe," she whispered. "But what if there's nothing worth stopping for?" We fell into a comfortable routine over the next few weeks. After her performances, Kate would join me at the bar, and we'd talk until the early hours of the morning. I found myself looking forward to those moments, and for the first time in years, I felt hope flickering inside me. As the weeks went by, our conversations grew deeper, and it wasn't long before Kate confessed that she had been in an abusive relationship years before, which had left her wary of trusting anyone. Her ex-husband had belittled her dreams, isolating her from friends and family, until she finally found the strength to leave. "It's why I ended up on these ships," she explained. "I needed to escape, to find myself again." "I know what it's like to want to escape," I admitted, feeling an unexpected connection to her story. I shared parts of my past, leaving out the darker details but being honest about my struggles, my mistakes, and the years I had lost. One night, as we stood on the deck, watching the moonlight dance across the waves, Kate turned to me. "You deserve happiness, Matt," she said softly. "So do you," I replied, reaching out to touch her hand. She didn't pull away, and we stood there, holding on to each other as the ship sailed into the night. We soon became inseparable. On our days off, we explored the islands where the ship docked, snorkeled in crystal-clear waters, and hiked through lush rainforests. Every moment felt like a second chance at life, and I was determined not to waste it. But happiness has a way of attracting attention. It wasn't long before Felix, the the ship's entertainment director, took notice of our blossoming relationship. He was a middle-aged man with thinning hair and an overinflated sense of his own importance, always looking for ways to maintain control over his staff. "Matt, can I have a word?" he asked one afternoon as I was restocking the bar. "Sure, what's up?" I replied, setting down the bottle in my hand. "I've noticed you and Kate have been spending a lot of time together," Felix said, folding his arms. "I'm going to give you some friendly advice. Don't get too attached. Ship romances never end well." "Thanks for the advice, Felix," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "But I think I'll take my chances." Felix narrowed his eyes, and I could see that he wasn't used to being challenged. "Just remember, I'm the one who decides who stays and who goes on this ship," he warned before walking away. I knew Felix's words were meant to intimidate me, but instead, they strengthened my resolve. I wasn't going to let anyone dictate how I lived my life. Not anymore. As Kate and I grew closer, I began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, I could have a future beyond the ship, something more than the life I had left behind. But fate had other plans. One evening, as I was serving drinks, I glanced toward the entrance and felt my heart stop. Standing there, in a flowing dress, was Lauren. She looked almost exactly the same as the day she walked out of my life, only more polished and refined. Her eyes scanned the room before they locked onto mine, and for a moment, I thought I might be dreaming. "What's wrong?" Kate asked, noticing the change in my expression. "Nothing," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just thought I saw someone I knew." Lauren's husband, Ethan, was right behind her, chatting animatedly with a group of passengers. I watched as they made their way to a table on the other side of the bar. I kept my distance, hoping to get through the night without any confrontation. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. A few nights later, it was New Year's Eve, and the ship was buzzing with excitement. Kate was performing one of her best sets to date, and the lounge was packed. I tried to stay focused, but every time I glanced across the room, I saw Lauren and Ethan sitting at their table, laughing and toasting with their friends. It was like a cruel reminder of everything I had lost. As the night went on, passengers started to filter out, and I began closing up the bar. That's when I noticed Lauren heading straight toward me. She moved with a confidence I hadn't seen in years, and as she stood in front of me, I felt a mix of anger, sadness, and something else I couldn't quite name. "Well, if it isn't Matt Harris," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I thought you were locked up for good." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. "It's been a long time, Lauren." "Not long enough," she snapped, leaning in closer. "I've heard you've been keeping busy since you got out." "What do you want?" I asked, tired of playing games. Lauren smirked. "I want you to know that I could ruin you again, just like before." I clenched my fists under the bar, fighting the urge to lash out. "Why are you doing this? Haven't you taken enough from me already?" "Because you deserve it," she hissed. "You were never good enough for me, and you never will be." Before I could respond, Ethan appeared, wrapping his arm around Lauren's waist. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" he asked, eyeing me suspiciously. "Just catching up with an old friend?" Lauren replied, flashing him a sweet smile. "But I think we're done here." They turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, shaken and furious. I took a few deep breaths, trying to clear my head, but the anger wouldn't fade. I finished cleaning up the bar and headed to my cabin, hoping Kate would be there. She was waiting for me, curled up on the bed with a book. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, closing the book and setting it aside. "I kind of have," I replied, sitting down beside her. I hesitated for a moment, then told her everything. About my past with Lauren, the years I'd spent in prison, and how seeing her tonight had dredged up all the pain I thought I'd left behind. Kate listened without interrupting, her expression soft and understanding. When I finished, she reached out and took my hand. "You're not that person anymore, Matt," she said quietly. "You've paid for your mistakes. You deserve to be happy." "Do I?" I whispered. feeling the weight of all those lost years pressing down on me. Yes, she insisted, squeezing my hand. But you have to let go of the past. I nodded, trying to believe her. But deep down, I knew that as long as Lauren was on that ship, the past would never let me go. The next day, Lauren and Ethan showed up at the seaside lounge again, but this time, Lauren's gaze was fixed on me the entire night. She didn't even pretend to be interested in her husband. Her eyes bore into mine, a silent challenge, and I could feel the old wounds reopening, bleeding out all the pain and resentment I'd buried. After Kate's performance, she came over to the bar, and I poured her a glass of wine. "She's here again," Kate said, nodding toward Lauren. "Yeah," I muttered. "And she's not going to leave me alone." "Well, then don't give her the satisfaction of knowing she's getting to you," Kate advised, resting her hand on my arm. But it wasn't that simple. The more Lauren pushed, the more I felt myself slipping back into the darkness I thought I'd escaped. The final straw came a few days later, on the last night of the cruise. The lounge was nearly empty when Lauren walked in, swaying slightly. She was clearly drunk, but her eyes were sharp, focused. She waited until the last of the guests had left before approaching me. "Still playing the good guy, huh, Matt?" she taunted, leaning against the bar. "What do you want, Lauren?" I asked, exhausted. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I want to know how it feels to lose everything, just like you made me lose everything." "I never made you lose anything," I snapped, my patience wearing thin. "You took years of my life, and now you're going to pay for it," she said, pulling out her phone. "I recorded every conversation we had on this ship. All I have to do is send this to Felix, and you're finished. You'll be fired, blacklisted from every cruise line, and you'll be lucky to find work as a janitor." My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the phone in her hand. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because I can," she replied with a smug smile. In that moment, something inside me snapped. All the years of pain, anger, and betrayal boiled over, and before I knew what I was doing, I grabbed her wrist and dragged her toward the balcony. "Let go of me!" she screamed, but I didn't listen. "You've taken everything from me," I growled, "but you won't take this." I lifted her over the railing, and for a brief second our eyes met. There was no fear, no pleading, just pure, unadulterated hatred. And then, I let go. Lauren's scream echoed through the night as she fell, disappearing into the dark waters below. For a moment, everything was silent, and I stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the spot where she had vanished. Slowly, I walked back into the lounge, shutting the door behind me. I wiped down the bar, cleaned the glasses, and made sure there was no evidence of our encounter. Then I headed back to my cabin, where Kate was waiting for me. I climbed into bed beside her, wrapping my arms around her as she murmured sleepily, "Did you finish closing up?" "Yeah," I whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "It's all taken care of." The next morning, the ship was in chaos. Rumors spread like wildfire that a passenger had fallen overboard. The crew gathered the passengers for an emergency meeting, and the captain announced that a search was underway, but everyone knew it was hopeless. We were in the middle of the ocean, and Lauren was gone. Kate stood next to me, her hand gripping mine tightly. "Do you think they'll find her?" she whispered. "No," I replied, my voice hollow. "No one could survive a fall like that." The investigation started immediately. The ship's security reviewed the surveillance footage, but there were no cameras on the balcony where Lauren had fallen. Ethan was distraught, insisting that his wife had simply gone for a walk and never returned. But as the hours passed, the truth became clear. There was no sign of Lauren anywhere on the ship. The crew interviewed everyone who had been in the lounge that night, including me. "I didn't see anything unusual," I lied, my heart pounding in my chest. "She seemed fine when she left." After hours of questioning, the captain concluded that it had been a tragic accident. The ship couldn't turn around, and there was no way to conduct a full search. They informed the passengers that there would be no further entertainment out of respect for the lost woman. Back in our cabin, Kate hugged me tightly. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I can't imagine how hard this must be for you." I nodded, unable to find the words to express the storm of emotions raging inside me. "She's gone," I muttered, more to myself than to Kate. 2 days later, we docked in Miami, and the authorities boarded the ship. They took statements from the crew and the passengers, including Ethan, who was nearly hysterical with grief. When it was my turn, I repeated the same story I had told the ship's security, that Lauren had been drinking, that I had seen her leave the lounge alone, and that I had no idea what happened after that. The officers seemed to accept my version of events, and after a few hours they left the ship, satisfied that it was nothing more than an unfortunate accident. It was over, for now. Kate and I stayed on the ship as it sailed back out to sea. I tried to convince myself that what I had done was justified, that Lauren had deserved it, but the guilt gnawed at me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't shake the image of her eyes, filled with hate, staring back at me as she fell. A week later, we docked in Key West, and I was surprised to see a familiar face waiting for me on the pier. It was David, dressed in a crisp white suit, looking completely out of place among the tourists and sunburned passengers. "What are you doing here?" I asked, shocked. "Just thought I'd check in on you," David replied, flashing that trademark grin. "Heard you had some excitement on this trip." "How did you know?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. "News travels fast, my friend," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Especially when it involves an old enemy of mine." "What do you mean?" I asked, suddenly feeling cold. David leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't think I'd let her get away with what she did to you, did you?" My blood ran cold. "You set this up?" "Not exactly," he said, leaning back. "I just made sure you had an opportunity. What you did with it was entirely up to you." I stared at him, stunned. "Why?" "Because you're my friend," David replied simply. "And friends take care of each other." For a moment I felt a wave of relief. I wasn't alone. Someone had my back. But then the weight of what I had done crashed down on me, and I realized that no amount of friendship could ever erase it. "Don't worry," David said, clapping me on the shoulder. "This stays between us. As far as the world's concerned, Lauren fell overboard. End of story." He left me standing there, staring out at the ocean, my mind racing. I thought about all the years I had spent locked up, the rage, the bitterness, the hatred that had driven me to that moment, and I realized that I wasn't free. I never would be. Kate found me later that evening, sitting alone on the deck. "Are you okay?" she asked, her eyes filled with concern. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't know if I'll ever be okay again." She took my hand, her touch warm and comforting. "You've been through so much," she said gently. "But you're not alone anymore. You have me now." I looked at her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was hope. "Thank you," I whispered, pulling her into my arms. The weeks turned into months, and the memory of that night began to fade, replaced by the happiness I found with Kate. We continued working on the cruise ship, traveling the world, and building a life together. But there were nights when I couldn't sleep, when I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, haunted by the ghost of a woman I had once loved, and the darkness that still lurked inside me. One evening, as we stood on the deck watching the sunset, Kate took my hand. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Just the future," I replied, squeezing her hand. "Well, whatever it is, we'll face it together," she said with a smile. And for the first time in years, I believed her. But deep down, I knew that some scars never heal, that some sins can never be forgiven. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, I whispered a silent goodbye to the man I used to be, hoping that maybe, one day, I could find peace.